The moment Princess Anne stepped forward, everything inside Buckingham Palace reportedly changed. It all began with a sealed protocol document that was quietly circulated through the palace during the earliest hours of the morning. According to insiders, the contents were considered so sensitive and controversial that several senior aides allegedly refused to even discuss it openly in palace corridors. But the situation became far more serious when Princess Anne herself emerged from a private strategy meeting carrying the red leather dispatch folder in her own hands. For many inside the royal institution, that single image immediately signaled the gravity of what was unfolding behind closed doors. Something written inside that document was believed to threaten the very structure of royal authority itself. Before the deeper details began surfacing, palace officials reportedly tried to contain the growing tension behind their familiar wall of silence. Yet behind closed doors, a highly unusual chain of events had already begun moving rapidly. Copies of the proposed protocol revisions were allegedly hand-delivered only to a very limited inner circle, completely bypassing normal palace communication systems. That decision alone triggered concern among longtime staff members because Buckingham Palace has always depended on hierarchy, ritual, and strict procedure to maintain order. Even quietly stepping outside those traditions suggested that the contents were explosive enough to override centuries of royal discipline. Sources close to the palace later whispered that the revisions were being presented as part of a wider modernization effort, a word that has increasingly created deep divisions inside the House of Windsor itself. Tensions reportedly escalated even further when Princess Anne was urgently summoned into private consultations alongside King Charles III and Prince William. What shocked insiders was not simply Anne's involvement, but the speed and seriousness surrounding it. Anne has long been viewed as one of the monarchy's most disciplined protectors, someone who rarely engages in visible conflict and almost never reacts emotionally to institutional changes. Yet according to whispers spreading through royal press circles, Anne allegedly described parts of the proposal as dangerously destabilizing, a phrase that instantly sent shockwaves throughout palace networks. Those words carried enormous weight because few people understood better than Anne that the monarchy survives not only through public support, but through invisible understandings that have held the royal family together through decades of scandal, betrayal, and crisis. What made the situation even more extraordinary was the unusually early involvement of palace legal advisors. Traditionally, constitutional experts are brought into discussions only after some form of internal agreement has already been reached. This time, however, legal teams were reportedly involved almost immediately, fueling speculation that the proposed revisions crossed into highly sensitive constitutional territory. Staff members were allegedly warned very directly not to leak information to journalists, and some were even instructed to avoid discussing the matter over palace phone lines altogether. Despite those warnings, fragments of the story still found their way into the hands of royal correspondents, setting off intense speculation across Britain's media landscape. Because underneath the language of modernization, many insiders feared something far more dangerous was unfolding, the possibility that long-standing balances of royal influence were about to be rewritten in ways the monarchy itself might not survive. But according to palace insiders, the proposed revisions were never just administrative adjustments. They touched one of the oldest unwritten understandings inside the House of Windsor. Long before televised coronations and carefully staged royal appearances, monarchies survived through rigid systems of rules and protocols that were designed not for comfort, but for survival. Historians close to the palace claim Princess Anne spent decades defending those traditions with near military discipline. Inside royal culture, protocol was never viewed as decoration. It was viewed as armor. Every bow, every order of entrance, every carefully measured distance between senior royals carried meaning that stretched back centuries. Those traditions were created during periods when monarchies could collapse almost overnight, when even a small break in hierarchy could trigger rebellion, humiliation, or political chaos. The House of Windsor inherited that understanding deeply, and few embodied it more completely than Queen Elizabeth II herself. Those who worked behind palace walls often described Elizabeth's philosophy as unwavering. The monarchy survives only when the institution remains bigger than the individuals inside it. Personal feelings could bend, public opinion could shift, but protocol could never appear weak. That belief shaped an entire generation of senior royals, but none absorbed it more completely than Princess Anne. Over the years, palace insiders quietly began referring to her as the guardian of continuity, someone who viewed ceremonial order not as outdated theater, but as the invisible structure holding the crown upright during its most dangerous moments. While younger royals occasionally questioned strict traditions, and reportedly saw those challenges as dangerous misunderstandings of how fragile royal legitimacy truly is. Because within royal culture, protocol is not simply etiquette. It is authority made visible. It reassures the public that the institution remains stable even when the family behind it is fractured by scandal, betrayal, and private conflict. And the monarchy has faced those fractures repeatedly throughout history. From abdication crises to bitter divorces, from public scandals to internal rivalries, every major crisis tested the palace's ability to project unity while chaos quietly brewed beneath the surface. During those moments, royal procedure became a defensive shield. Carefully staged appearances, strict lines of succession, formal ceremonies, and even seemingly minor traditions were used to restore public confidence whenever trust began slipping away. Palace veterans understood something the outside world often overlooked. Once protocol begins appearing optional, the monarchy itself can begin looking uncertain. And uncertainty is the one thing hereditary institutions fear most. That is why Anne's reported outrage over the proposed revisions carried such extraordinary significance. To her supporters, weakening long-established structures in the name of modernization risked opening doors the monarchy might later struggle to close. History had already shown what happens when royal systems appear vulnerable. Public loyalty begins to shift, internal factions grow bolder, and the carefully balanced machinery sustaining the crown slowly starts turning against itself. Yet what reportedly unsettled palace insiders even more was not simply the existence of the proposed rewrite, but the growing suspicion that influential figures inside the royal household may have quietly supported it from the very beginning. That possibility alone sent tension throughout Buckingham Palace to another level entirely. At first, aides allegedly attempted to dismiss the situation as nothing more than routine disagreements over modernization. But behind palace walls, insiders claimed factions were forming at an alarming pace, and for the first time in years, Princess Anne and several senior advisors appeared openly aligned against certain elements operating within King Charles III's own household. According to royal insiders, the conflict was no longer being viewed as a simple debate about updating traditions. Instead, the atmosphere inside the palace reportedly became deeply strained, with traditionalists and reformers pulling the monarchy in completely opposite directions. One side believed the crown could survive only by preserving its rigid ceremonial foundations. The other argued that the institution needed to become leaner, more modern, and more publicly relatable if it hoped to remain relevant in the future. What made the situation especially dangerous, however, was the fact that both groups genuinely believed they were saving the monarchy from eventual collapse. Caught directly in the center of that growing divide was King Charles himself. Palace insiders reportedly described a monarch torn between instinct and pressure, trapped between loyalty to inherited traditions and the relentless demand to reshape the crown for a changing Britain. For years, Charles had openly supported aspects of a streamlined monarchy, envisioning a smaller and more efficient royal structure that would appear less extravagant to the public. Yet critics within the institution allegedly feared that the modernization agenda was beginning to evolve into something far more dangerous, a slow dismantling of the very structures that had historically protected royal authority from political vulnerability. As tensions quietly intensified, reports began emerging that Prince William had privately increased consultations with Princess Anne herself. That revelation reportedly stunned many within royal circles because Anne has historically avoided factional maneuvering altogether. Her influence has never come through public campaigning or political strategy, but through discipline, restraint, and unwavering institutional loyalty. If William was truly seeking her guidance behind closed doors, many insiders believed it signaled that concerns within the royal family had reached an extraordinarily serious level. Some courtiers allegedly feared that disagreements over protocol were beginning to spill into sensitive discussions surrounding succession optics and the monarchy's future public identity. And inside the palace, that fear carried enormous consequences. Palace veterans understood something critical. The public can tolerate scandal far more easily than uncertainty. Once the monarchy begins appearing divided internally, public confidence weakens rapidly. Royal correspondents soon started noticing the palace's unusual silence whenever questions about internal restructuring surfaced publicly. Official briefings became vague and carefully worded. Public appearances appeared increasingly controlled. Even longtime royal journalists reportedly struggled to obtain direct denials regarding the rumors, fueling suspicion that something much larger was unfolding beneath the surface. Behind closed doors, anxiety reportedly grew around the wider implications of the so-called streamlined monarchy agenda. Critics feared the proposals risked reducing senior royal roles to little more than symbolic public functions while quietly concentrating influence within a smaller inner circle. To traditionalists, that did not represent evolution. It represented erosion, a dangerous weakening of the balance that had protected the House of Windsor through generations of crisis and instability. As arguments inside the palace deepened, one deeply unsettling question allegedly began circulating among insiders. If ancient protocols could suddenly be rewritten, what else inside the monarchy might eventually become negotiable? That question reportedly became even more alarming when attention shifted toward a single controversial clause hidden deep within the proposed amendments. According to several palace interpretations, one specific revision triggered Princess Anne's immediate and forceful opposition. Critics allegedly feared that the adjustment would weaken centuries of ceremonial authority in favor of what one insider described as a monarchy shaped by convenience rather than duty. At the center of the controversy was a clause reportedly designed to reduce the formal weight carried by certain senior royal functions during major constitutional and ceremonial events. On paper, supporters argued the revision looked technical, modern, and harmless. Advocates allegedly insisted it would streamline royal operations and modernize public perception for a faster and less tradition-bound era. But inside palace walls, the reaction was reportedly far colder. To traditionalists, the amendment symbolized something profoundly dangerous, the quiet dismantling of symbolic structures that had protected the crown's authority for generations. Because within the monarchy, symbolism is never treated as merely symbolic. Every title, every placement, every carefully preserved ritual reinforces the hierarchy that gives the institution legitimacy in the eyes of both government and public. According to insiders, Princess Anne immediately recognized the deeper implications behind the proposal. Sources close to the palace claimed she warned senior figures that once ceremonial authority begins bending for convenience, the monarchy risks entering a cycle of institutional erosion that becomes almost impossible to reverse. That warning reportedly echoed throughout multiple private consultations as anxiety spread among veteran courtiers and constitutional advisors alike. Their fears extended far beyond the immediate moment. What truly concerned them was the precedent such a change could establish for future reigns. If one generation of royals could dilute long-standing protocol in response to modern pressure, what would prevent future monarchs from reshaping succession customs, royal duties, or constitutional expectations whenever public opinion shifted again? That question reportedly triggered urgent legal scrutiny throughout the palace. Constitutional advisors, who had already become unusually involved from the start, allegedly began reviewing whether aspects of the amendment carried wider constitutional implications than initially acknowledged. While the monarchy publicly projects certainty and permanence, insiders understand how delicate its balance truly is. Many of the institution's most powerful traditions are unwritten, sustained not through legislation but through acceptance, repetition, and disciplined continuity across generations. Disturb those foundations too aggressively, insiders feared, and the monarchy risks weakening the invisible authority that keeps it politically untouchable. As debate intensified further, comparisons to previous royal crises quietly began resurfacing inside palace discussions. Some insiders reportedly referenced the abdication crisis of King Edward VIII, when personal desires collided catastrophically with institutional expectations. Others pointed toward the damaging years that followed the breakdown of royal marriages and public trust during the late 20th century. In every case, the monarchy survived by reasserting stability through strict adherence to structure and protocol. That history made the current proposal feel especially alarming to the palace old guard, many of whom believed the institution was now risking instability voluntarily rather than responding to an unavoidable crisis. Outside palace walls, royal commentators soon began sensing the growing tension as well. Television analysts, newspaper correspondents, and veteran royal biographers all noticed subtle but unmistakable signs of internal conflict. Official briefings became increasingly contradictory. Palace language turned unusually cautious. And perhaps most revealing of all, no senior royal figure moved decisively to dismiss the rumors outright. That silence only intensified public speculation that the battle unfolding inside the monarchy had become far more serious than most people yet understood. But according to palace insiders, Princess Anne's objection was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, the monarchy's old guard was already preparing what many later described as a coordinated counteroffensive against the proposed reforms. If palace modernizers believed and would eventually compromise quietly, insiders claimed they had profoundly misunderstood the woman often referred to as the monarchy's most disciplined enforcer. Within days, what some palace sources allegedly began calling the Iron Protocol response reportedly moved into full operation. According to those familiar with the internal discussions, and reacted with extraordinary speed and precision, treating the proposed revisions not as a simple political disagreement, but as a direct threat to the long-term survival of the crown itself. Senior allies who had spent decades defending royal traditions were quietly drawn into emergency consultations, forming what insiders described as a rapidly consolidating wall of resistance deep inside the palace structure. Unlike younger advisors focused heavily on public image and modernization strategies, these figures represented the monarchy's older institutional core, ceremonial authorities, constitutional experts, palace historians, and veteran officials who believed that once royal structure begins collapsing internally, public loyalty soon follows. At the same time, speculation reportedly intensified that Prince William had quietly begun supporting efforts to preserve key ceremonial protections as well. According to palace insiders, that support carried enormous weight behind closed doors because William was no longer viewed merely as the future face of the monarchy, but increasingly as its long-term safeguard. Senior courtiers allegedly feared that weakening protocol today could create instability that William himself would eventually inherit as king. While he remained outwardly disciplined and publicly silent, insiders claimed William increasingly aligned with Anne's argument that modernization could never come at the cost of institutional authority. For reformers inside the palace, that realization reportedly proved deeply unsettling. Resistance was no longer limited to traditional courtiers or aging royal advisors. It now appeared connected directly to the future line of succession itself. Soon after, emergency reviews of ceremonial procedures were reportedly launched across multiple areas of palace operations. Ancient precedents that had long remained buried inside royal archives were suddenly being re-examined by palace legal teams searching for historical safeguards against institutional overreach. Some advisors allegedly worked late into the night revisiting constitutional moments dating back generations, attempting to determine whether previous restructuring efforts had ever placed the monarchy at similar risk. And according to insiders, the more deeply they searched into royal history, the more uneasy the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace became. Again and again, history seemed to reveal the same brutal lesson. Monarchies rarely collapse all at once. More often, they weaken slowly over time, piece by piece, as the traditions sustaining them are gradually stripped away in the name of practicality and convenience. As pressure mounted internally, senior courtiers reportedly took the extraordinary step of freezing portions of the implementation process altogether. Meetings were delayed. Draft revisions were rewritten repeatedly. Internal approvals slowed almost to a standstill. The old guard, long dismissed by critics as ceremonial relics with fading influence, suddenly reasserted enormous control over palace operations. And with every passing day, the divide inside the royal household reportedly became more difficult to hide. That growing fracture placed King Charles III in an increasingly impossible position. According to insiders, Charles found himself trapped between two completely different visions of monarchy. One side urgently pushing toward adaptation and modernization, while the other warned that survival depended entirely on restraint and continuity. Reports suggested the king was eventually pressured into assuming more of a mediating role, desperately attempting to prevent the escalating conflict from spiraling into open institutional warfare. But by that point, many insiders feared the damage had already been done. Because once factions inside a monarchy begin maneuvering openly against one another, even privately, unity itself becomes dangerously fragile. And as the internal battle deepened, palace officials reportedly became terrified of one possibility above all others: the monarchy appearing visibly divided before the public. Already weakened by illness, pressure, and exhaustion, King Charles III allegedly found himself overwhelmed by the competing visions surrounding the institution he had spent his entire life preparing to inherit. According to several royal insiders, the strain inside Buckingham Palace soon became impossible to ignore. For decades, Charles had lived beneath the immense shadow of Queen Elizabeth II, carefully observing the discipline and emotional restraint that allowed her to survive scandal after scandal without publicly losing control of the institution. But now, as king, Charles reportedly faced a crisis far more personal than ceremonial. The battle unfolding behind palace walls was no longer simply about protocol revisions or modernization plans. It had evolved into a painful struggle over the monarchy's identity itself, a confrontation between preserving inherited stability and reshaping the institution for an uncertain future. Sources close to the palace suggested the emotional toll on Charles became increasingly severe as tensions escalated between competing factions. Advisors pushed conflicting solutions. Senior courtiers warned of irreversible institutional damage. Reformers insisted the monarchy risked appearing disconnected from modern Britain if change continued being resisted too aggressively. And directly at the center of it all stood Charles, burdened not only by constitutional responsibility, but by the terrifying reality that every decision now carried historic consequences. Those who had observed him closely over the years reportedly sensed a monarch deeply aware that even one major miscalculation could weaken the institution he had spent an entire lifetime trying to protect. Yet amid all the uncertainty and pressure, Princess Anne reportedly remained completely unwavering. According to insiders, Anne repeatedly insisted that duty had to come before comfort, popularity, or short-term public approval. To her, the monarchy's survival had always depended on discipline, the willingness to preserve structure even during moments of intense criticism and emotional pressure. That philosophy, shaped through decades of navigating royal crises, reportedly became the moral backbone of the resistance movement forming quietly within palace walls. Anne's supporters allegedly believed that once the monarchy begins reshaping itself according to political moods or media trends, it risks surrendering the permanence that gives the institution its meaning. At the same time, Prince William was said to be increasingly focused on protecting institutional stability above all else. While publicly careful and measured, insiders claimed William understood the growing danger of allowing visible fractures to emerge inside the royal family during such a vulnerable period. Public confidence, once shaken, can become extraordinarily difficult to restore. Slowly, the outside world also began sensing that something significant inside the monarchy was changing. Royal correspondents noticed unusual delays in palace responses. Carefully choreographed displays of unity began feeling strained and controlled. Even commentators traditionally loyal to the monarchy quietly started comparing the atmosphere to earlier periods of royal instability that had seriously damaged public trust in the past. Inevitably, comparisons to Queen Elizabeth II's leadership style also became unavoidable. During periods of national uncertainty, Elizabeth consistently projected discipline, calm, and continuity, rarely allowing personal conflict to overshadow institutional duty. To many inside the palace, that stabilizing model now appeared painfully absent. Because unlike earlier royal crises centered around scandal or public controversy, this conflict struck directly at the monarchy's internal foundations. It questioned not only who held influence behind palace walls, but what the crown itself should ultimately become in the decades ahead. But in the end, according to palace insiders, the monarchy appeared to return to the same principle that had protected it for generations: survival through discipline rather than reinvention. Almost as suddenly as the controversy had emerged, palace aides reportedly began quietly stepping back from the proposed changes. There was no dramatic announcement, no public admission, and no official declaration of defeat. Instead, only subtle signals began appearing behind palace walls, suggesting that the institution's oldest defenders had once again prevailed. Insiders claimed the shift became unmistakable during private meetings. Discussions that had once aggressively pushed modernization suddenly slowed into near silence. Draft revisions stopped circulating altogether. Advisors who had previously supported restructuring allegedly became increasingly cautious, even reluctant to revisit the issue openly. According to sources close to the palace, the proposed protocol changes were never formally cancelled. Instead, they were quietly delayed into what many insiders believed was permanent limbo. Within royal culture, outright defeat is rarely acknowledged publicly. Unwanted ideas are simply absorbed into endless reviews and procedural delays until they slowly disappear from discussion entirely. And according to several insiders, this particular disappearance carried the unmistakable fingerprints of Princess Anne and the institutional old guard who had resisted the reforms from the beginning. Senior staff members were reportedly instructed to avoid discussing the controversy entirely, even during private conversations with trusted media contacts. Yet that silence only deepened the growing belief that something highly significant had unfolded behind palace walls. Royal correspondents immediately noticed the sudden change in tone. Official palace language subtly shifted back toward older ceremonial phrasing. Traditional protocol references quietly reappeared in scheduling procedures and public planning. To ordinary observers, those adjustments may have seemed minor and almost invisible. But within royal culture, such details carry enormous meaning because they reveal where influence truly exists inside the institution. Increasingly, insiders believed that influence was once again consolidating around the defenders of continuity and preservation. Following the crisis, Princess Anne's standing inside the monarchy reportedly strengthened considerably. Not because she sought recognition publicly, but because many within the palace believed her resistance had protected the institution from drifting into dangerous uncertainty. For years, critics had described Anne as rigid, emotionally distant, and uncompromising. But among traditionalists, those same qualities were now being reframed as strengths, proof that when institutional survival was threatened, Anne remained willing to prioritize duty above popularity, media approval, or political fashion. At the same time, Prince William quietly emerged from the internal struggle with a noticeably transformed reputation inside royal circles. Insiders increasingly began viewing him not simply as the future public face of the monarchy, but as its future institutional guardian as well. His reported alignment with preservation efforts reassured senior courtiers who feared the crown might gradually abandon the very structures that once protected it from instability and political vulnerability. For many within the palace, William's role during the crisis suggested that the monarchy's next generation might ultimately prove far more traditional than many reformers had expected. Meanwhile, advocates of aggressive modernization reportedly began losing momentum throughout the royal household. The atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace allegedly shifted away from confident restructuring and back toward cautious preservation. Palace veterans, long suspicious of rapid institutional change, interpreted the outcome as confirmation that the monarchy still understood its oldest survival instinct: never move faster than public trust can tolerate. Because throughout history, royal institutions have rarely collapsed simply because they resisted change. More often, insiders argued, they begin unraveling after changing too quickly and weakening the symbolic authority that once made them untouchable in the public imagination. Among palace insiders, the entire episode soon acquired a cold and almost haunting description: a silent victory. There were no celebrations, no public speeches, and no open declarations of triumph. Only the quiet restoration of order through pressure, discipline, patience, and carefully controlled influence. Yet according to those closest to the monarchy, the real significance of the conflict was never truly about paperwork or procedural revisions. At its core, the battle centered on something much larger: who ultimately controls the future meaning of the crown itself. Inside Buckingham Palace, documents can always be rewritten, alliances can fracture, and influence can quietly shift behind velvet curtains. But according to those who understand the institution best, one principle inside the monarchy remains immovable: the crown survives only when duty outweighs personal ambition. That belief has haunted the corridors of the royal institution for generations. Long after scandals faded and political crises passed, the monarchy endured because certain figures within it accepted a burden far heavier than privilege or celebrity. They understood that the crown was never designed to function like ordinary fame or temporary political leadership. Instead, it was built as something colder, older, and infinitely more demanding: a sacred responsibility carried from one reign to the next through discipline, sacrifice, and relentless self-control. Few embodied that philosophy more completely than Princess Anne herself. For decades, Anne operated not as the monarchy's most glamorous figure, but as one of its most dependable protectors. While public attention often drifted toward scandal, romance, controversy, and modern reinvention, and remained firmly anchored to the ancient logic that had preserved the House of Windsor through some of its darkest moments. To her supporters, Anne's resistance during the Protocol crisis was never about ego, personal influence, or power. It was about preventing the monarchy from slowly surrendering the invisible structures that gave the institution permanence and authority in the first place. Because inside royal culture, protocol is never viewed as simple ceremonial performance. It represents memory, hierarchy, continuity, and institutional identity made visible before the nation. Strip those things away carelessly, insiders feared, and the monarchy risks becoming indistinguishable from the constantly changing political world surrounding it. And according to palace insiders, that same philosophy now appears to be taking deeper root within Prince William as well. The future king reportedly emerged from the internal conflict with a stronger understanding of why the old guard fought so fiercely to preserve ceremonial order. Not because they feared change itself, but because they feared instability disguised as progress. William's quiet alignment with institutional preservation suggested something deeply significant to many within the palace, that the monarchy's next chapter may not abandon tradition nearly as aggressively as many outsiders once predicted. Instead, it may attempt the same delicate balancing act that increasingly defined the reign of King Charles III, adapting carefully while never allowing the foundations beneath the crown to crack. According to insiders, that balancing act may ultimately become the defining struggle of Charles's reign itself. He inherited a monarchy caught between two worlds, one demanding modernization at accelerating speed, the other warning that survival depends entirely on resisting the temptation to move too far and too fast. Somewhere inside that growing tension existed the real story behind the protocol battle that quietly shook Buckingham Palace. It was never truly about paperwork, ceremonial wording, or internal procedure alone. At its heart, it was a battle over legacy itself, over whether the monarchy remains an institution shaped primarily by duty and continuity, or transforms into something more flexible, more modern, but potentially far more fragile. History has repeatedly shown that monarchies rarely collapse through sudden explosions. More often, they erode slowly from within after tradition loses authority and discipline gradually gives way to convenience. And perhaps that is why the battle mattered so deeply to those inside Buckingham Palace. They believed they were not simply defending old customs or outdated rituals. They were defending the invisible architecture holding the crown together itself. Because inside the House of Windsor, protocol is never viewed as merely a set of rules. It is seen as the invisible wall protecting the monarchy from collapse. Thanks for watching this story unfold. But according to royal insiders, what happened behind the walls of Buckingham Palace may continue shaping the monarchy for years to come. While the public only caught fragments of the tension, those inside the institution allegedly understood that the protocol battle exposed something far deeper than a disagreement over ceremonial wording or modernization plans. It revealed how fragile the balance inside the House of Windsor can become whenever tradition and reform begin pulling the crown in opposite directions. Palace veterans reportedly viewed the entire episode as a warning sign, proof that even centuries-old institutions are never completely protected from internal division. Because although the monarchy projects stability to the outside world, insiders know that much of its authority depends on invisible understandings quietly maintained between generations of royals, advisors, and constitutional traditions. Once those understandings begin weakening, uncertainty can spread rapidly through the institution itself. That fear, according to sources close to the palace, is exactly what drove Princess Anne's determination throughout the crisis. She reportedly believed that even small compromises involving ceremonial authority could eventually open the door to much larger institutional instability in the future. According to several insiders, Anne never viewed the battle as personal. To her, it was always about preserving the monarchy's long-term survival. Supporters within the palace claimed and understood something many outsiders often miss. Royal institutions do not survive through popularity alone. They survive through consistency, discipline, symbolism, and the public belief that the crown remains anchored to something permanent and unshakable even during periods of national uncertainty. That philosophy reportedly guided nearly every decision and made during the internal struggle. While reformers focused heavily on public image and modernization, Anne and her allies allegedly focused on protecting continuity itself. Because within royal culture, continuity is not simply tradition for tradition's sake. It is the mechanism through which authority is transferred safely from one reign to another without destabilizing the institution. Palace insiders also claimed the crisis quietly reshaped how Prince William is now viewed behind closed doors. Before the controversy, many had seen William primarily as the monarchy's future public representative, someone expected to modernize the crown while maintaining public popularity. But after reports emerged suggesting he privately supported preservation efforts alongside insiders increasingly began seeing him as a future protector of institutional order as well. That shift reportedly reassured many senior courtiers who feared the monarchy might gradually abandon the ceremonial structures that historically protected it from political pressure and instability. To traditionalists, William's involvement suggested the future of the crown may remain far more cautious and disciplined than some reformers originally hoped. Meanwhile, supporters of rapid modernization reportedly became far more careful following the backlash surrounding the proposed revisions. According to insiders, the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace shifted noticeably away from aggressive restructuring and back towards slower, more controlled adaptation. Palace veterans allegedly interpreted the outcome as confirmation that the monarchy still understood one of its oldest survival lessons. Meaningful change must happen carefully enough that the institution never appears unstable in the eyes of the public. Because throughout history, royal institutions rarely fall apart all at once. More often, they weaken slowly after symbolic authority begins eroding piece by piece. That historical reality reportedly haunted many of the advisors involved in the protocol conflict. Some insiders even believed the crisis forced senior royals to confront uncomfortable questions about the monarchy's future direction in a rapidly changing Britain. How much modernization can the institution absorb before it begins losing the very traditions that give it meaning? How far can ceremonial authority bend before public confidence starts weakening? And perhaps most importantly, who inside the royal family ultimately decides where that line should be drawn? According to palace sources, those questions remain unresolved even now. Although the immediate conflict may have faded from public attention, insiders claimed the deeper philosophical divide inside the monarchy never fully disappeared. On one side remained those who believed the crown must evolve more aggressively in order to survive future generations. On the other stand traditionalists who argue that survival depends precisely on resisting rapid transformation. And caught between those competing visions continues to be King Charles III himself, a monarch reportedly still trying to balance modernization with preservation while carrying the enormous weight of protecting the institution inherited from Queen Elizabeth II. According to those closest to the palace, Charles understood perhaps better than anyone how dangerous visible division inside the monarchy can become. Throughout his entire life, he watched his mother preserve stability through discipline, restraint, and carefully controlled continuity. But now, as king, Charles reportedly faces a far more complicated challenge, leading a monarchy through an era where public expectations evolve faster than royal institutions historically move. That tension, insiders claimed, lies at the heart of nearly every internal debate unfolding behind palace walls today. Yet despite the uncertainty, one principle reportedly continues guiding the monarchy's most powerful defenders: the belief that duty must always remain greater than personal ambition, public pressure, or temporary political trends. Few figures represented that principle more consistently than Princess Anne during the protocol crisis. While others debated modernization strategies and media optics, and allegedly focused on protecting the institutional framework that has allowed the monarchy to survive through wars, scandals, abdications, divorces, and generational upheaval. To many within the palace, her resistance became symbolic of something larger than a policy disagreement. It became a reminder that the monarchy's authority has always depended as much on invisible discipline as on visible ceremony. And according to insiders, that same understanding now appears increasingly shared by Prince William as well. The future king reportedly emerged from the conflict with a stronger appreciation for why continuity matters so deeply within hereditary institutions. Not because tradition should never evolve, but because once public faith in institutional stability begins collapsing, rebuilding it can take generations. That realization may ultimately shape how William approaches the crown in the future. Rather than pursuing dramatic reinvention, insiders believe he may instead favor cautious adaptation while preserving the symbolic structures that continue giving the monarchy legitimacy. If true, That approach would place him far closer to Princess Anne's philosophy than many observers once expected. Ultimately, palace insiders insist the protocol battle was never simply about one controversial document or a single proposed amendment. It represented something far more important, a struggle over the monarchy's future identity. Would the House of Windsor remain an institution defined primarily by continuity, duty, and ceremonial permanence? Or would it gradually transform into something more modern, flexible, and publicly responsive, but potentially less stable in the long term? According to those closest to the conflict, that debate remains unresolved beneath the surface even today. Because history repeatedly shows that monarchies rarely collapse through sudden disaster alone. More often, they erode quietly over time whenever discipline weakens, symbolic authority fades, and institutional continuity begins giving way to convenience. That fear reportedly haunted many inside Buckingham Palace throughout the crisis. They believed they were not simply protecting old traditions or ceremonial rituals. They believed they were protecting the invisible foundations holding the crown together itself. And perhaps that is why the struggle became so intense behind closed doors. Inside the House of Windsor, protocol has never been viewed as mere formality. To those guarding the monarchy's survival, it remains the invisible structure protecting the crown from uncertainty, instability, and eventual collapse. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next update. According to several royal insiders, the deeper impact of the protocol conflict may not fully reveal itself for years. While the public saw only scattered rumors and carefully controlled palace responses, those working behind the scenes allegedly understood that the battle represented a defining moment for the future direction of the monarchy itself. Buckingham Palace has survived countless scandals, public controversies, and political changes across generations, but insiders claimed this conflict felt different because it challenged the institution from within. It was not simply a disagreement over modern image or ceremonial adjustments. It became a confrontation over the very principles that have historically kept the crown stable during periods of national uncertainty. Palace veterans reportedly believed the danger was never limited to one proposal alone. What frightened many traditionalists was the possibility that once long-standing structures begin bending under pressure, future generations could slowly push those boundaries even further. According to sources close to the palace, Princess Anne repeatedly warned that institutional erosion rarely happens suddenly. Instead, it unfolds gradually, one compromise at a time, until the original structure becomes almost unrecognizable. That belief reportedly shaped nearly every move and made during the crisis. Insiders claimed she viewed herself not as a political player inside palace factions, but as a defender of continuity itself. To Anne and her allies, protecting protocol meant protecting the monarchy's ability to survive beyond the personalities currently occupying royal positions. Because within hereditary institutions, continuity is often considered more important than popularity. Public opinion rises and falls constantly, but the authority of the crown depends on convincing the nation that the monarchy stands above temporary political moods and media cycles. According to several courtiers, that philosophy became the emotional center of the resistance movement forming quietly behind palace walls. Even as reformers argued that modernization was necessary to keep the institution relevant for younger generations, traditionalists allegedly feared that moving too aggressively could weaken the very symbolism that gives the monarchy legitimacy in the first place. Palace insiders claimed the debate eventually became far more emotional than outsiders realized. On the surface, discussions focused on ceremonial wording, protocol revisions, and structural efficiency. But beneath those technical details existed a much larger fear, whether the monarchy could adapt to the modern world without slowly surrendering the traditions that made it unique. That tension reportedly haunted nearly every private consultation taking place inside Buckingham Palace during the crisis. Senior advisors pushed conflicting strategies. Some believed public trust depended on appearing modern, relatable, and streamlined. Others insisted the crown's strength came precisely from remaining rooted in history, ritual, and continuity even as society changed around it. At the center of those competing visions stood King Charles III, reportedly carrying the immense burden of balancing both sides while trying to prevent the institution from appearing fractured before the public. Sources close to the palace claimed Charles deeply understood the risks involved in either direction. Move too slowly, and the monarchy risks appearing disconnected from modern Britain. Move too quickly, and the institution risks weakening the symbolic authority that has protected it for generations. According to insiders, that impossible balancing act increasingly defined Charles's reign during the Protocol crisis. The pressure reportedly became even heavier because Charles inherited not only the crown, but also the enormous legacy of Queen Elizabeth II. For decades, Elizabeth projected extraordinary stability through discipline, emotional restraint, and careful protection of royal continuity. During moments of national crisis, her ability to place institutional duty above personal emotion became one of the monarchy's greatest strengths. But insiders claimed Charles now faces a dramatically different world, one where public expectations evolve faster than royal institutions are traditionally designed to move. That reality reportedly intensified the internal struggle over how much modernization the monarchy could safely absorb without destabilizing itself. Amid all the uncertainty, Princess and allegedly remained one of the few senior royals who never wavered publicly or privately. According to palace sources, and consistently argued that duty must remain the monarchy's guiding principle regardless of media pressure or changing political trends. Her supporters believed and understood that hereditary institutions survive only when they maintain a sense of permanence stronger than the controversies surrounding them. That permanence, insiders argued, is created through discipline, symbolism, hierarchy, and continuity, the very elements many reformers wanted to soften in the name of modernization. As the conflict deepened, insiders reportedly began noticing Prince William moving closer toward Anne's perspective as well. While William remained publicly measured and avoided open involvement, sources claimed he increasingly recognized the dangers of allowing visible instability to develop inside the royal family during such a sensitive period. Palace veterans allegedly believed William understood something crucial about public psychology. Scandal alone rarely destroys confidence in the monarchy, but visible uncertainty can weaken trust extraordinarily fast. That realization reportedly influenced William's growing support for preserving key ceremonial protections during the crisis. According to insiders, his alignment with institutional continuity reassured many senior courtiers who feared the monarchy's future leadership might prioritize modernization too aggressively. Instead, William increasingly appeared to favor careful adaptation balanced against the preservation of royal authority and symbolic stability. That perception significantly strengthened his standing among palace traditionalists. At the same time, advocates of aggressive restructuring reportedly became more cautious after witnessing the intensity of resistance forming around Anne and the old guard. According to palace sources, several proposed reforms quietly disappeared into extended review processes following the backlash. Meetings slowed. Discussions became more controlled. Internal language reportedly shifted away from bold restructuring and back toward careful preservation. To outsiders, these adjustments may have appeared insignificant. But within royal culture, even subtle procedural changes can signal major shifts in influence and power. Many insiders interpreted the outcome as evidence that the monarchy's oldest survival instincts still remained deeply active beneath the surface. Because throughout history, royal institutions have often survived precisely by resisting rapid transformation during moments of instability. That historical lesson reportedly shaped much of the palace's response as the crisis gradually faded from public attention. Yet despite the temporary calm, insiders claimed the deeper philosophical divide inside the monarchy never truly disappeared. Questions surrounding modernization, ceremonial authority, and institutional identity reportedly continue lingering beneath palace operations even now. How much should the monarchy evolve in order to remain relevant? At what point does modernization begin weakening the traditions that sustain royal legitimacy? And who ultimately decides where the balance between adaptation and continuity should exist? According to sources close to the institution, those questions may continue shaping the future of the House of Windsor for decades to come. Because beneath every royal ceremony, public appearance, and carefully staged display of unity lies a much larger struggle, preserving an ancient institution inside an increasingly modern world without allowing the foundations beneath it to crack. As palace tensions slowly faded from public headlines, insiders reportedly began reflecting on what the protocol crisis had truly revealed about the monarchy's future. According to several royal sources, the the battle exposed how deeply divided opinions inside Buckingham Palace had become regarding the institution's long-term survival strategy. For years, discussions about modernization had existed quietly beneath the surface, but the proposed revisions allegedly forced those disagreements into the open in a way few senior royals had expected. Suddenly, the monarchy was no longer debating only public image or ceremonial efficiency. It was confronting a far more dangerous question: whether the crown could continue adapting to a rapidly changing society without weakening the very traditions that historically protected its authority. Palace veterans reportedly viewed that dilemma as one of the greatest institutional challenges facing the House of Windsor in modern history. Unlike political systems that can reinvent themselves after elections or leadership changes, monarchies depend heavily on continuity, symbolism, and inherited legitimacy. Once public confidence in those foundations begins weakening, restoring it can become extraordinarily difficult. According to insiders, that fear shaped much of the old guard's response during the crisis. Princess Anne, in particular, allegedly believed the monarchy's greatest strength had always been its ability to project permanence during uncertain times. While governments rise and fall, prime ministers change, and public moods shift constantly, the crown survives by appearing stable above everything else. That principle reportedly guided and throughout the internal conflict. To her supporters, preserving protocol was never about resisting progress for the sake of tradition alone. It was about protecting the invisible structure that allows hereditary authority to remain credible in the modern world. Because within royal culture, symbolism carries enormous power. Every ceremony, every formal title, every carefully observed ritual reinforces the idea that the monarchy represents something larger and more enduring than individual personalities. Insiders claimed and feared that weakening those structures too aggressively could slowly blur the line separating the crown from ordinary public institutions. And once that distinction begins disappearing, the monarchy risks losing the sense of permanence that gives it unique authority. According to palace sources, many traditionalists quietly believed that modernization efforts sometimes underestimated how fragile public trust in hereditary institutions can actually become. While reformers focused heavily on appearing relatable and contemporary, the old guard allegedly worried that too much flexibility could unintentionally create uncertainty about the monarchy's long-term purpose. That concern reportedly became especially serious during debates surrounding ceremonial authority and constitutional symbolism. Some insiders feared that reducing the weight of traditional royal functions might gradually weaken the institution's ability to project stability during future national crises. History, they argued, repeatedly demonstrated that monarchies survive not simply because people admire them, but because they symbolize continuity during periods of political and social instability. Those historical lessons reportedly remained central to Princess Anne's thinking throughout the protocol dispute. Sources close to the palace claimed and often viewed royal discipline as a form of institutional protection rather than personal restriction. Duty, restraint, hierarchy, and ceremonial order were not obstacles to survival in her eyes. They were the mechanisms through which survival became possible in the first place. That philosophy, insiders alleged, increasingly influenced Prince William as well during the later stages of the conflict. While publicly careful and disciplined, William reportedly came to recognize how dangerous visible instability inside the monarchy could become if internal disagreements ever spilled too openly into public view. According to several courtiers, William understood that public trust in the crown depends heavily on the perception that the institution remains united, controlled, and emotionally disciplined even during difficult periods. Once visible fractures begin emerging, confidence can deteriorate rapidly. That realization reportedly pushed William closer toward Anne's emphasis on institutional continuity and controlled adaptation rather than aggressive reform. Palace insiders claimed his growing alignment with preservation efforts reassured many senior advisors who had worried that future generations of royals might prioritize modernization at the expense of long-standing ceremonial authority. Instead, William increasingly appeared committed to balancing evolution carefully while protecting the symbolic foundations beneath the crown. That perception significantly strengthened his reputation among traditionalists inside Buckingham Palace. Meanwhile, advocates of rapid restructuring reportedly became far more cautious after witnessing the resistance generated by the proposed revisions. According to insiders, palace discussions surrounding modernization grew quieter and more controlled following the crisis. Proposed reforms moved through slower review processes. Public messaging became increasingly careful. Internal debates reportedly shifted away from dramatic restructuring and toward more gradual adaptation designed to avoid triggering further institutional conflict. To outsiders, these procedural changes may have seemed almost invisible. But within royal operations, even subtle shifts in language or scheduling often signal much deeper changes in influence and strategy. Many palace veterans interpreted the outcome as proof that the monarchy still relied heavily on its oldest survival instinct, preserving stability above everything else. According to several insiders, the protocol battle also forced senior royals to confront uncomfortable realities about the future. Britain itself has changed enormously over recent decades, and public expectations surrounding the monarchy continue evolving rapidly. Younger generations often view institutions differently than previous eras did. Media scrutiny moves faster than ever before. Public patience for privilege without accountability has weakened significantly. All of those pressures reportedly intensified the internal debate over how much modernization the monarchy could safely pursue without destabilizing itself in the process. King Charles III allegedly found himself carrying the full weight of that dilemma throughout the crisis. Sources close to the palace claimed Charles genuinely understood the arguments coming from both sides. He reportedly recognized the need for modernization while also understanding the risks involved in weakening ceremonial continuity too aggressively. That balancing act became one of the defining pressures of his reign. According to insiders, Charles often appeared deeply aware that every major decision now carried long-term consequences not only for his own rule, but for the monarchy's survival under future generations as well. The pressure reportedly became especially intense because Charles inherited the crown after the extraordinarily stable reign of Queen Elizabeth II. For decades, Elizabeth represented consistency, emotional discipline, and institutional continuity during periods of enormous national change. Many insiders believed her leadership style created a standard that may be almost impossible for future monarchs to fully replicate. Yet despite those challenges, palace sources claimed the protocol conflict ultimately reinforced one important lesson inside Buckingham Palace. Survival depends less on dramatic reinvention and more on disciplined adaptation. According to traditionalists, the monarchy has historically survived precisely because it evolves slowly enough to preserve public confidence in its permanence. Move too quickly, and the institution risks appearing unstable. Refuse all change entirely, however, and the crown risks appearing disconnected from modern society. Finding the balance between those extremes reportedly remains one of the monarchy's greatest ongoing struggles. And according to insiders, that struggle did not end when the protocol revisions quietly disappeared from discussion. It simply moved back beneath the surface, where debates about the future of the crown continue unfolding quietly behind palace walls even now. Because within the House of Windsor, every decision involving protocol, symbolism, and continuity ultimately connects to a much larger question. What kind of monarchy will survive in the generations ahead, and how much change can the institution absorb before the foundations beneath it begin to weaken? According to palace insiders, one of the most unsettling aspects of the protocol crisis was how quickly it revealed the fragile balance between public image and institutional survival inside the monarchy. For decades, Buckingham Palace carefully maintained the appearance of unity, discipline, and continuity regardless of what tensions existed privately behind closed doors. But during the internal conflict surrounding the proposed revisions, many insiders allegedly feared that balance was beginning to crack under growing pressure. The monarchy was no longer facing only outside criticism from media commentators or political voices. Instead, the debate had become deeply internal, involving senior royals, trusted advisors, constitutional experts, and long-standing palace officials who fundamentally disagreed over the future direction of the institution itself. According to sources close to the palace, that internal divide created one of the most emotionally tense environments Buckingham Palace had experienced in years. Traditionalists reportedly feared the monarchy was moving dangerously close to sacrificing stability in pursuit of modernization, while reformers believed failing to evolve aggressively enough could eventually make the institution appear outdated and disconnected from modern Britain. Both sides claimed they were trying to protect the crown, yet their visions for survival could not have been more different. At the center of those competing pressures stood King Charles III, carrying what insiders described as an almost impossible responsibility. Charles allegedly understood the need for adaptation better than many traditionalists, having spent decades advocating for a more streamlined and publicly efficient monarchy. Yet he also inherited the deep institutional caution shaped by Queen Elizabeth II's reign, where continuity and discipline were always treated as essential safeguards protecting royal authority. According to palace sources, Charles increasingly found himself caught between those two instincts, the desire to modernize carefully while avoiding any appearance that the monarchy's foundations were becoming unstable. That balancing act reportedly became emotionally exhausting as tensions intensified behind palace walls. Advisors presented conflicting recommendations. Public pressure continued growing. Meanwhile, every internal disagreement carried the potential to weaken confidence in the institution if it ever became fully visible to the outside world. Palace veterans allegedly understood how dangerous that possibility could become. Throughout royal history, scandals alone rarely caused the monarchy's greatest damage. More often, serious crises emerged when the public began sensing uncertainty inside the institution itself. Once confidence in continuity starts weakening, hereditary systems can become extraordinarily vulnerable. That fear reportedly shaped much of Princess Anne's resistance throughout the protocol battle. According to insiders, and consistently believed that preserving institutional confidence mattered far more than responding quickly to changing public trends. Her philosophy remained rooted in the idea that the monarchy survives precisely because it projects permanence while the world around it changes constantly. To Anne and her allies, protocol was never meaningless ceremony. It was the visible language through which the crown communicates authority, order, and continuity to the nation. Every formal tradition, carefully observed ritual, and symbolic gesture reinforced the idea that the monarchy existed above temporary political moods and media cycles. Insiders claimed and feared that weakening those structures too aggressively could gradually blur the distinction between the monarchy and ordinary public institutions. Once that separation weakens, she reportedly believed, public faith in the crown's permanence could begin eroding much faster than many reformers realized. According to several palace veterans, Anne's perspective carried enormous influence precisely because she spent decades navigating some of the monarchy's most difficult crises. From public scandals to family breakdowns, constitutional anxieties, and periods of collapsing public trust, Anne allegedly witnessed firsthand how heavily the institution depended on discipline during unstable moments. Those experiences reportedly convinced her that continuity must always remain stronger than temporary pressure for change. Sources close to the palace claimed and repeatedly warned that institutional erosion rarely announces itself dramatically. More often, it develops gradually through a series of seemingly minor compromises that slowly weaken the structures protecting royal authority. That fear became central to the old guard's resistance during the protocol conflict. At the same time, insiders reportedly observed Prince William becoming increasingly aligned with concerns surrounding long-term institutional stability as well. Although William avoided public involvement and maintained strict discipline externally, palace sources claimed he privately recognized the dangers of allowing visible internal fractures to develop during such a sensitive period. According to several courtiers, William understood that future monarchs inherit not only ceremonial titles, but also the consequences of decisions made generations earlier. Weakening institutional authority today could create instability that future reigns may struggle to repair. That realization allegedly strengthened William's support for preserving key ceremonial protections during the crisis. Insiders claimed many senior advisors found reassurance in William's growing emphasis on continuity because it suggested the monarchy's future leadership might prioritize stability as strongly as modernization. Rather than pursuing dramatic reinvention, William increasingly appeared focused on balancing adaptation carefully against the preservation of symbolic authority and institutional legitimacy. That perception reportedly elevated his standing considerably among traditionalists within Buckingham Palace. Meanwhile, advocates of rapid reform allegedly became more cautious following the backlash generated by the proposed revisions. According to insiders, palace discussions involving modernization shifted noticeably in tone after the crisis intensified. Proposals moved through slower review processes. Language surrounding restructuring became more restrained. Public messaging reportedly emphasized continuity far more heavily than before. Although no official acknowledgement of defeat ever emerged, many palace veterans privately interpreted the slowdown as evidence that the old guard had successfully reasserted significant influence over the monarchy's direction. Yet despite the temporary victory for traditionalists, insiders insisted the larger debate inside the institution never truly disappeared. Questions surrounding modernization, ceremonial authority, and the monarchy's long-term role in British society reportedly continue shaping discussions behind palace walls even now. Britain continues evolving socially, politically, and culturally at a rapid pace, and royal advisors remain deeply aware that public expectations surrounding the crown are changing as well. Younger generations often demand greater transparency, relatability, and accountability from institutions historically built around hierarchy and distance. Balancing those expectations against the monarchy's need for continuity remains one of the institution's greatest modern challenges. According to palace insiders, the protocol conflict ultimately exposed how difficult that balance may become in the years ahead. The monarchy cannot remain entirely frozen in tradition forever, yet moving too aggressively risks weakening the symbolism and permanence that give hereditary authority its meaning. That tension reportedly continues haunting internal palace discussions long after the immediate crisis faded from public attention. Because inside the House of Windsor, survival has never depended solely on public popularity. It has always depended on preserving the invisible structure connecting one reign to the next without allowing the institution itself to appear fragile. And according to those closest to the monarchy, protecting that invisible structure may remain the crown's greatest challenge in the modern era. According to several palace insiders, the protocol crisis ultimately became far more than an internal disagreement over ceremonial revisions. Behind the scenes, it reportedly forced the monarchy to confront one of the most difficult questions in its modern history: how to remain relevant in a rapidly changing world without losing the traditions that give the institution legitimacy in the first place. For generations, the House of Windsor survived by balancing continuity with gradual adaptation. But during the conflict surrounding the proposed changes, insiders claimed many senior figures feared that balance was beginning to shift too aggressively toward modernization. Traditionalists allegedly worried that in the effort to appear more contemporary and publicly relatable, the monarchy risked weakening the symbolic authority that had historically protected it during periods of crisis. According to palace sources, that fear became especially intense because the debate unfolded during an already vulnerable period for the institution. King Charles III had only recently inherited the crown after the historic reign of Queen Elizabeth II, whose leadership became almost synonymous with discipline, continuity, and emotional restraint. For decades, Elizabeth projected stability regardless of personal hardship or political turbulence surrounding the monarchy. Many insiders believed her ability to maintain that sense of permanence became one of the institution's greatest strengths. But following her passing, Buckingham Palace reportedly entered a far more uncertain period where every internal disagreement carried greater emotional and symbolic weight. Sources close to the palace claimed Charles deeply understood the historical importance of continuity, yet also recognized that modern public expectations could no longer be ignored entirely. That tension allegedly shaped nearly every aspect of the protocol debate. On one side stood advisors pushing for a monarchy that appeared leaner, more efficient, and more connected to ordinary public life. On the other stood traditionalists warning that excessive flexibility could slowly erode the structures protecting royal authority itself. According to insiders, Charles increasingly found himself trapped between those competing visions while attempting to prevent visible division from emerging publicly. Palace veterans reportedly feared that if the monarchy ever appeared openly fractured during such a transitional era, public confidence could weaken much faster than many people realized. Throughout history, hereditary institutions have depended heavily on the perception of stability. Once that perception begins collapsing, rebuilding trust can become extraordinarily difficult. That concern allegedly drove much of Princess Anne's determination throughout the conflict. Insiders claimed and viewed the protocol battle through a far longer historical lens than many reformers inside the palace. To her, the issue was never simply about updating ceremonial wording or adjusting royal functions for modern audiences. It was about protecting the continuity that allows the monarchy to survive from one generation to the next without appearing politically vulnerable or emotionally unstable. According to palace sources, and believed the crown's authority depended heavily on maintaining visible structure even during moments of internal uncertainty. Every royal ceremony, public ritual, and carefully observed protocol reinforced the idea that the institution remained disciplined regardless of private conflict behind the scenes. Remove too much of that symbolic structure, and reportedly feared, and the monarchy risks appearing temporary rather than permanent. That concern became especially serious during discussions surrounding constitutional symbolism and ceremonial hierarchy. Palace insiders claimed and repeatedly warned that institutional erosion rarely happens through dramatic collapse alone. More often, it develops slowly over time as traditions lose authority piece by piece. What begins as modernization can eventually weaken the very continuity that allows hereditary institutions to survive long-term political and social change. Those fears reportedly resonated strongly with many senior courtiers who had spent decades protecting the monarchy through periods of scandal, public criticism, and constitutional anxiety. According to insiders, the old guard increasingly viewed the protocol revisions not as isolated reforms, but as part of a larger struggle over the monarchy's future identity. At the same time, Prince William reportedly emerged from the crisis with a much deeper appreciation for the importance of institutional stability as well. Although William remained publicly silent and carefully disciplined throughout the controversy, palace sources claimed he privately understood how dangerous visible instability could become for the monarchy during such a sensitive period. According to several advisors, William recognized that future kings inherit not only the privileges of the crown, but also the consequences of decisions made by previous generations. Weakening symbolic authority today could create challenges future reigns may struggle to contain. That realization allegedly influenced William's growing support for preserving ceremonial continuity during the internal conflict. Palace insiders claimed many traditionalists found reassurance in William's approach because it suggested the monarchy's future leadership might prioritize careful preservation alongside modernization rather than pursuing dramatic transformation. Instead of rapid reinvention, William increasingly appeared committed to gradual adaptation that protects the institution's symbolic foundations while still allowing measured evolution over time. That balance reportedly strengthened his reputation significantly among senior palace figures concerned about the monarchy's long-term survival. Meanwhile, advocates of aggressive reform allegedly became increasingly cautious after witnessing the intensity of resistance generated by the proposed changes. According to palace sources, discussions surrounding modernization grew quieter following the crisis. Internal reviews slowed considerably. Proposals reportedly underwent heavier scrutiny before moving forward. Public palace messaging also shifted subtly back toward themes of continuity, tradition, and institutional stability rather than bold restructuring. To outside observers, those adjustments may have appeared almost invisible. But within royal operations, even small changes in tone or ceremonial language often reflect much deeper shifts in power and influence. Many insiders interpreted the outcome as proof that the monarchy's oldest survival instincts remained deeply embedded within Buckingham Palace. Because historically, royal institutions rarely survive through dramatic reinvention alone. More often, they endure by adapting slowly enough to preserve public belief in their permanence and continuity. Yet despite the temporary victory for traditionalists, insiders insisted the deeper philosophical conflict inside the monarchy never truly disappeared. Britain continues changing socially, culturally, and politically at extraordinary speed, and royal advisors remain fully aware that younger generations often view institutions differently than previous eras did. Public expectations surrounding accountability, relatability, and transparency continue evolving rapidly. That reality ensures the debate over modernization versus continuity will likely continue shaping palace discussions for years to come. According to insiders, the protocol crisis simply exposed those tensions more openly than ever before. Because beneath every ceremonial appearance, official statement, and carefully choreographed display of unity lies a much larger struggle over what the monarchy should become in the future. Should the House of Windsor continue prioritizing symbolism, hierarchy, and permanence above all else? Or should it evolve into a more flexible and modern institution designed to reflect changing public attitudes more directly? Palace insiders claimed no easy answer currently exists. Instead, the monarchy remains caught between two competing realities: the need to evolve enough to survive modern expectations, while preserving enough continuity to avoid weakening the authority that gives the crown meaning in the first place. And according to those closest to the institution, maintaining that balance may ultimately become the defining challenge facing the House of Windsor in the decades ahead. According to palace insiders, the final stage of the protocol crisis left behind a quieter but far more lasting impact than many initially realized. Once the immediate tension faded and the proposed revisions were effectively set aside, Buckingham Palace reportedly entered a period of controlled calm that masked a deeper internal reassessment. There was no public acknowledgement of victory or defeat, no formal statement clarifying what had happened behind closed doors. Instead, as is often the case within the monarchy, silence itself became the clearest signal that a resolution had been reached internally. Insiders claimed that within days of the controversy cooling down, internal discussions subtly shifted away from restructuring and back towards stabilizing existing frameworks. Meetings that had once been dominated by urgent debates over modernization reportedly returned to more traditional administrative concerns. The tone inside the palace, according to those familiar with the situation, became noticeably more cautious, as though the institution itself had collectively stepped back from the edge of a major transformation. Many senior courtiers allegedly interpreted this shift as a reaffirmation of the monarchy's long-standing instinct for self-preservation through continuity. Because throughout its history, the House of Windsor has rarely embraced rapid change during moments of internal instability. Instead, it has tended to slow down, reassess, and reinforce existing structures until confidence in the institution is fully restored. According to insiders, that pattern appeared once again during the aftermath of the protocol dispute. Princess Anne's role in this phase reportedly became even more symbolically significant. While she did not publicly comment on the matter, palace sources claimed her influence was widely recognized internally as one of the key stabilizing forces during the crisis. To her supporters within the institution, Anne's position represented more than resistance to reform. It represented a broader philosophy that viewed monarchy as something that must remain anchored in discipline, hierarchy, and ceremonial continuity regardless of external pressure. Insiders alleged that Anne's perspective continued to shape private discussions even after the most intense phase of the conflict had passed. Her argument, according to those familiar with palace thinking, was consistently centered on one core idea, that the monarchy's strength does not come from adapting quickly to every cultural shift, but from maintaining a sense of permanence that transcends short-term change. That belief reportedly resonated strongly with several senior figures who had long served under Queen Elizabeth II and were deeply influenced by her approach to institutional stability. At the same time, Prince William's position within the post-crisis environment was also reportedly evolving in subtle but important ways. According to palace insiders, William emerged from the episode with a heightened awareness of how fragile internal unity can become when strategic visions begin to diverge too sharply. While he remained committed to ensuring the monarchy remains relevant in a changing society, sources claimed he also developed a deeper appreciation for the importance of pacing that change carefully. Insiders suggested that William increasingly viewed his future role as one of balancing adaptation with preservation rather than choosing one over the other. That perspective reportedly placed him closer to the traditionalist mindset than many observers outside the palace had previously assumed. Within royal circles, this alignment was interpreted as a reassuring sign that future transitions in leadership may not bring abrupt or destabilizing shifts in the monarchy's core structure. Instead, it suggested a more gradual and controlled evolution guided by institutional caution rather than rapid reform. Meanwhile, reform-minded advisors allegedly became more restrained in the wake of the controversy. According to sources close to the palace, there was a noticeable shift in tone among those advocating modernization. While their broader goals did not disappear, their approach reportedly became less aggressive and more incremental. Proposals were framed more carefully, language was softened, and emphasis was placed on long-term adaptation rather than immediate structural change. Many insiders interpreted this as a practical response to the resistance encountered during the protocol crisis, as well as a recognition that institutional change within the monarchy often requires extended timelines to avoid destabilizing its foundational legitimacy. Even so, palace veterans reportedly emphasized that the underlying tension between tradition and modernization has not been resolved. Instead, it has simply returned to a quieter state beneath the surface of day-to-day operations. According to insiders, Buckingham Palace continues to operate with two parallel instincts constantly in play. one pushing toward careful modernization to reflect a changing public landscape, and another insisting on preserving ceremonial continuity as the core of royal authority. That tension, they claim, is not new, nor is it likely to disappear. What changed during the protocol crisis was not the existence of that divide, but the level of visibility it briefly reached. For a short period, internal disagreements became unusually exposed, creating a rare glimpse into the complexity of decision-making inside one of the world's most closely guarded institutions. But as is often the case with the monarchy, the system eventually returned to a state of controlled opacity, where decisions are made quietly and only their outcomes are visible to the public. In the end, insiders described the resolution of the crisis not as a dramatic turning point, but as a restoration of equilibrium. The proposed reforms faded from active discussion, traditional structures regained prominence, and the monarchy resumed its familiar rhythm of carefully managed continuity. Yet beneath that surface stability, the questions raised during the conflict remain present. How should the monarchy evolve in a modern democratic society? How far can tradition be adapted before it begins to lose meaning? And how can an ancient institution remain relevant without undermining the very foundations that have sustained it for centuries? According to palace insiders, those questions will continue shaping the monarchy long after this particular crisis has been quietly set aside. Because within Buckingham Palace, the most important battles are rarely the ones the public sees. They are the ones that unfold slowly, privately, and persistently over time, shaping the future of the crown one careful decision at a time.